So in the condition where you have suppression and real control, what do you do? Well, that's of course a significant question. I think one outcome has been what I have this afternoon I was talking about is the emergence of what I call non-movement, which is something different, is closer to movement, but I can't go into detail. But as such, it is not organized, structured, identifiable movements. Other may be, in fact, the development of some kind of a social movement, but in a different form. I think, to me, ultimately, what defines a social or political movement is not really its form. What defines a social movement or political movement is its power. Its power. The power of a movement consists of a power to cause three important things: to cause threat, to cause uncertainty, and to cause disruption on the part of the authorities. Through these three things, we actually put pressure on the authorities or adversaries to make concessions and do reform. Right? If a movement cannot do this, then it is not effective. So I think that the green movements actually, in terms of disruption, that is people, like in Egypt, going into the street and disrupting order upon which the state is responsible, that has been probably lost because of repression, because people now are really at home or in their workplaces, not on the street. But however, I think that it still retains the power of to cause threat and uncertainty. And I think this threat and uncertainty is something one can read from the regime, from the adversaries, from the regime. It's constantly, every day, they say that the movement is dead, and yet they are talking about fitna, the sedition. Constantly they're talking about it. So they feel something that they feel that they are very much threatened. It has actually some way disrupted the ordinary sort of normal flow of operation of the government. In fact, there have been a lot of ceremonies and so on that usually the government, like religious ceremonies that have been going on, but after the Green Movement, they have stopped that, because that is a potential for, again, for the realignment and sort of collective presence, physical presence of movement activists in the public spaces. So in a sense, there is a situation is not ordinary, it is pretty extraordinary. And of course, as you mentioned, Mr. Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei, today he speaks about about the Egyptian revolution. Why does he do it? Because he's actually feeling threat in the sense that people are comparing, the Green Movement with what is going on in Egypt. So this exists. Of course, dissatisfaction and dissent is the cause, obviously. Psychologically, that is the basis of why we become sort of activists, or others become activists. Of course, it existed for a long time before the emergence of the Green Movement. But this dissent in post-election became channelized. There's a difference between dispersed dissent and, of course, channelized dissent. There's a difference between, rain everywhere, and then when this rain channelizes, it becomes a river. And the river that has a name, that has a symbol, it has color, is a green river. It has a direction and some kind of a supervision as well on the part of those people whom the green activists consider to be leaders. For instance, Mr. Karoubi or the other one, Mr. Mousavi, although they themselves say that we are not leaders. We talked about it. Leadership is not that you appoint yourself as leaders. Leadership is one which others appoint you as leaders, right? They give you the authority to be leaders. So there is a supervision for this river as well. But this is a peculiar, however, kind of movement. it lacks, of course, a centralized social movement organization. And of course, it's a problem that you don't have an office, a headquarters, that people go there and talk and strategize and so on. It is very difficult. And it cannot have because of the sheer repression. But there do exist, of course, certain networks that connects different constituencies to one another. Of course, networks and connections could be both physical, it could be real, and even it could be imagined. And even imagined network and imagined solidarity could be extremely important to make a particular movement alive. So I think it has, as I mentioned, a leadership, but in fact, the leadership that identified leadership that the Green movement has even is more pronounced than the leadership that Egypt sort of uprising has. So there is such a thing. I think it is, but however, the leaders themselves say, well, we are not one. It's kind of a peculiar situation. Also, this movement is very diffuse. It is evolving with very diverse constituencies, a lot of different ideas. Is religious, secular, some radical, some gradualist. So it's very diverse, and a lot of discussion is going on, which of course is a characteristic of social movements. There is a debate in it, but at the same time, it's a situation where people are adding new claims and sometimes doubting. Anyway, the whole apparatus, the whole entity, which I call it the Green movement, is something which is, in a way, it is nowhere, but at the same time everywhere. It is like a loud voice. It is like a noise, a strong wind, steam that exists. It's there. It affects, but it is not really. It cannot be captured. But of course, it has some weaknesses too, and I think it's very important to take that into account. And I'm going to finish after this. So, what do you do? How do you sustain a movement under a repressive state? Is the $100 million question. How do you do it? Of course, organizations like Akhwan al-Muslimin or Muslim Brothers, which was established since 1928, has existed, and it does exist, and has gone through, a number of ebbs and blows, a lot of repressive phases, but it has survived. But that movement has survived because of very strong organization. A strong organization in the workplaces, in the neighborhoods, in the clubs, in the women's groups, in the youth groups, in cooperatives, and so on. And so the issue of kinship, friendship, and worship, these three things are extremely significant for the survival of such a movement. So now those people who are supporters of Green should think, what type of organization is needed in order to sustain its continuity. There is also, of course, pluralism and democracy. And as I said, there's a lot of debate and discussion, this is good. But also it does have the danger of differentiation and discord. One of the interesting things about the revolution is that because it is so rapid, unity is formed very rapidly, primarily because of the vagueness and ambiguity of the message of a revolution. There isn't much of a debate to understand, what it exactly means, because it's rapidly is done. Either whether it is Islamic or non-Islamic or democracy. Okay, we'll bring democracy. So people project their ideals in that particular broad slogan, and the unity is achieved. And unity is very important to put pressure on the adversaries. But in the case of social movements, is open, and there is debate and discussion, and that has the danger also differentiation and discord as well. So there has to be a conscious decision to, in some way, contain, those discussions, not to lead to disintegration. And finally, I think there is as I said, despite the fact that the Green Movement leadership and many activists basically have argued that we are movement, we are for reform, and we don't want a revolution. But as I mentioned, whether they like it or not, it can happen. And in such a situation, what would be the really response and the approach of a green movement? After all, Bouazizi, who started to ignite himself, and then, as a sense of protest, did not intend to ignite a revolution, but it happened. So what would be the position of the Green leaders and the Green movement to such a possibility? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Asef Bayat. Actually, your comment about even the imaginary dimension, which is not to say unreal by any stretch, some would say more real, but certainly the imaginary connection that one feels in social movements and revolutionary situations, that's the subject of a wonderful essay in The People Reloaded that I would just love to call your attention to, by Nasreen Alavi, an Iranian journalist living in both Tehran and London, and the essay is called "This Magic Green Bracelet," and it's all about that very theme.